Why was Commander Ryan Caldwell frozen in place that morning, staring at something that made 15 years of combat experience feel suddenly inadequate? The pre-dawn light painted the Afghan mountains in shades of bruising purple, and the air carried that biting cold that seeps through every layer you wear, settling into your bones like a warning. Ryan had seen everything in his career. He'd run missions in places that never made it onto official reports, commanded operations that would remain classified for decades, and at 38, he was the youngest SEAL commander his unit had ever had. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for what he was witnessing in the shadows of that forward operating base. The camp was waking slowly, that mechanical stirring of a military machine coming to life. Ryan moved through it like a ghost, observing, reading the mood of his world. He passed the enlisted barracks where the air hung thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and stale tobacco, that sharp contrast to the surgical precision he preferred in his own space. And that's when he saw her, a lone figure emerging from the latrines, scrubbing her hands with a rough brush until the skin turned raw and red. It wasn't normal cleaning. It was violent, compulsive, like she was trying to wash away something far deeper than the grime of the base. Her eyes were fixed on the drain with a thousand-yard stare, the kind that spoke of a mind occupying a completely different coordinate than the body it inhabited. Ryan felt something cold settle in his chest. He'd seen that look before, in soldiers who'd been pushed past their breaking point, who'd found a way to disconnect from the present just to survive it. As he moved closer to the barracks entrance, the smell hit him first. Heavy ammonia, sharp and unmistakable, the stench of urine radiating from the corner bunk assigned to female personnel. He watched from the shadows as she approached her sleeping area, and then she stopped. Just stopped dead. The dark stains spreading across her wool blanket told a story of calculated cruelty. Her personal locker had been pried open, family photos torn into confetti and scattered into the wet mess of the bed. A final touch to ensure she had no sanctuary left anywhere in this place. A group of privates near the door were watching her, waiting. Their eyes glittered with that pack mentality of predators who'd sensed weakness and were starving for the reaction they knew would justify their next move. They wanted her to cry. They wanted her to scream. They wanted her to break. Instead, she silently stripped the ruined bedding, rolled it into a tight bundle with movements that were almost mechanical in their precision, marched it to the incinerator bin outside, her face a mask of terrifying neutrality. When she returned to the bare metal springs of the cot, she laid down her poncho liner and sat on the steel frame without a single word. She refused to give them what they were hunting for, and Ryan felt a cold rage hardening in his gut like concrete. The mess hall was usually a place of low-level chaos, but that morning, a strange, heavy silence hung over the table near the door. Ryan watched from the coffee line as 3 infantrymen stood over a lone figure, eating a cold MRE. Specialist Hayes kicked the table leg hard enough to send the plastic spoon clattering onto the dusty floor, his boot leaving a muddy streak on the metal. He leaned in, whispering something that made the other 2 soldiers snicker, their eyes darting around to ensure no officers were watching. The figure at the table didn't flinch, didn't look up, didn't retrieve the spoon. She simply tore off a piece of the ration bread with oil-stained fingers and continued eating, her gaze fixed on the wall as if the men were nothing more than static on a radio channel she'd learned to tune out. But the degradation didn't stop there. It was systematic, rehearsed. Hayes grabbed a napkin dispenser and slowly, deliberately emptied its contents over her head. The cheap paper fluttered down like snow on a grave. "Looks like you missed a spot cleaning the latrines, Harper," he sneered, his voice carrying that sickening sweetness of a bully who knows he's protected by the herd. "Maybe you should eat on the floor. It's closer to where you belong." He waited for a reaction, a tear, a clenched fist, anything to justify the violence bubbling under his skin. But she remained a statue carved from granite, chewing her dry bread with a mechanical rhythm that was somehow more terrifying than any explosion of anger could have been. Before she could swallow, Hayes grabbed her tray and upended it. The watery powdered eggs and cold beans splattered onto her boots and the pristine floor she'd likely just mopped. He didn't just spill it. He ground the food into the linoleum with his heel, creating a slip hazard and a scene that humiliated everyone who witnessed it. "Clean it up, janitor," he commanded, dropping a filthy rag onto the mess that splashed sauce onto her cheek. "And don't even think about getting seconds. Rations are for combat personnel, not baggage." The room held its breath, waiting for her to break, waiting for her to throw a punch that would get her court-martialed. Instead, she slowly picked up the rag, wiped the sauce from her face with a single sharp motion, and began cleaning the floor on her hands and knees while Hayes stood over her, his crotch uncomfortably close to her face, asserting a dominance that made Ryan's hand drift instinctively toward the sidearm he wasn't wearing. Then Hayes grabbed the back of her chair, tilting it dangerously backward until her boots left the floor. The tension in the room spiked. A dozen other soldiers paused their meals to watch the show, their faces a mix of cruel amusement and indifferent fatigue. Her knuckles turned white where she gripped the table edge, but she didn't make a sound. Her body was rigid with a control that screamed of practice rather than fear. Hayes let the chair slam back down with a bone-rattling thud, laughing as coffee sloshed out of her cup onto her hand, scalding skin. She wiped the liquid away on her pant leg, a slow, deliberate motion that somehow insulted Hayes more than a scream would have. His face flushed red with impotent aggression, and Ryan saw something shift in the air. Something dangerous. But what Ryan didn't know yet was that this woman sitting in silence, enduring humiliation with a discipline that cost her something to maintain, was about to change everything he thought he understood about strength. What was it about the weapons bay that morning that made a 15-year veteran SEAL commander stop in his tracks and simply stare? The sun was just clearing the Hindu Kush when Ryan took his usual early walk through the armory. The base was still half asleep. Most troops either crashed out after night patrol or gearing up for the day. He liked these quiet hours. They let him check gear and read his team's mood without the weight of formal inspections hanging over everything. As he turned past the armory door, he froze. The air in the bay was thick with the smell of CLP gun oil and the metallic tang of old brass. In the corner, a workbench had been shoved against a drafty corrugated wall, far away from the heaters where the other armorers worked. It was a designated exile zone. The light bulb above it flickered with a dying buzz that would have driven a lesser person mad. But the soldier sitting there seemed to exist in a vacuum of silence. Her world had narrowed down to the microscopic interplay of steel and polymer. She wasn't just cleaning a weapon. She was communing with it. Her fingers read the metal like Braille, searching for imperfections invisible to the naked eye but catastrophic at 3,000 meters. Someone was already hard at work, completely lost in the task of breaking down a Barrett M82 A150 caliber sniper rifle. The massive weapon lay across the bench in neat, perfect rows of parts, every piece arranged like surgical instruments. What stopped Ryan wasn't the hour or the precision. It was the soldier doing the work. It was the same woman from the mess hall. Staff Sergeant Brooke Harper didn't look like any movie sniper Hollywood ever dreamed up. She stood maybe 5'4" with calloused hands that danced over the components like a concert pianist. Her dark hair was twisted into a tight regulation bun, and her desert camo carried the permanent dust and wear of someone who lived in the field. There was something almost peaceful in how she worked, every motion smooth and deliberate. A group of mechanics passing by the open bay door slowed down, one of them spitting a stream of tobacco juice just inches from Brooke's boot. "Check the headspace, sweetie," one jeered, his voice dripping with condescension. "Don't want to blow your pretty face off." They laughed, a grating, ugly sound that echoed in the metal hangar. Brooke paused for a microsecond, her hand hovering over the firing pin before resuming her rhythm. She didn't acknowledge them, didn't give them the satisfaction of a glare. But Ryan saw the muscle in her jaw bunch tight, a physical manifestation of the restraint keeping her from snapping. It was the kind of discipline that cost something to maintain, a silent tax she paid just to exist in this space. Ryan moved closer, drawn by something he couldn't name. He watched her fingers work with a precision that spoke of thousands of hours, maybe tens of thousands. She checked the recoil spring tension, inspected the firing pin for wear, and measured the headspace with a gauge so carefully it was almost reverent. Every movement was deliberate, practiced, perfect. "How long you been working on the Barrett?" Ryan asked quietly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up, and for the first time Ryan saw her eyes clearly. They were dark, almost black in the dim light, and they carried a weight that had nothing to do with the 50-pound rifle in front of her. "3 years, sir," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Before that, it was the M24. Before that, whatever they'd let me touch." "You shoot it too, or just maintain it?" Something flickered across her face, something that might have been pride or pain or both. "I shoot it, sir, when they let me." When they let her. The words hung in the air like smoke. Ryan studied her more carefully now, taking in the details he'd missed before. The way she positioned her body to minimize her presence, making herself small in a space that clearly didn't want her. The way her hands never stopped moving, as if stillness would make her too visible, too easy a target. "What's your longest confirmed?" he asked. She hesitated, and in that hesitation, Ryan saw the calculation. The weighing of whether honesty would help or hurt her. Whether this SEAL commander was genuinely curious or just another person waiting for her to claim something she couldn't back up so he could laugh at her presumption. 2,400 meters, sir," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Helmand Province, 18 months ago." Ryan felt something shift in his chest. 2,400 meters, nearly a mile and a half. That was elite-level shooting. That was the kind of distance where wind became a living thing, where the Earth's rotation mattered, where the bullet spent so long in the air that the target could theoretically walk away before impact. "Who was your spotter?" "I didn't have one, sir. It was an opportunity shot. Right place, right time, right target." No spotter. Ryan let that sink in. A solo shot at that distance meant she'd done all the calculations herself, read the wind herself, made the call herself, and lived with the consequences herself. It was either the mark of extraordinary skill or extraordinary recklessness, and looking at the careful way she handled every component of that rifle, Ryan was betting on skill. "Why are you working out here?" he asked, gesturing to the exile corner. "Why not with the other armorers?" Her jaw tightened again, that muscle bunching with the effort of staying neutral. "They prefer it this way, sir. Says I don't fit the profile. Says I make them uncomfortable." Ryan felt that cold rage returning, the same rage he'd felt watching her clean her ruined bedding, watching her scrub food off the mess hall floor. But beneath the rage was something else. Curiosity, respect, and the beginnings of an idea. "You ever work with SEALs before, Harper?" She looked up sharply, surprise breaking through her carefully maintained neutrality. "No, sir. Army doesn't usually attach snipers to your teams. You bring your own." "Usually," Ryan agreed. "But we've got a situation developing. High-value target in the mountains. Long-distance shot. Very long distance. And the truth is, Harper, my best shooter is down with a shoulder injury. I need someone who can make a shot that'll go in the record books, and I need them ready in 72 hours. He watched her process this, watched hope and fear and disbelief chase each other across her face before she locked it all down again behind that mask of neutrality. But her hands had stopped moving for the first time since he'd arrived, and that told him everything he needed to know. "Why me, sir?" she asked quietly. "You've got a dozen shooters who could." "Because I've been watching you for 3 days, Harper. I've seen what they do to you. I've seen how you handle it. And I've seen the way you work on that rifle like it's the only thing in the world that matters. I need someone who can hold steady under pressure that would break most people. I need someone who's already proven they can take everything the world throws at them and still show up the next morning. I need you." The silence stretched between them, heavy with possibility and danger, and the weight of a decision that could change everything. Brooke looked down at the rifle parts spread across her bench, at the careful order she'd created in her exile corner, and Ryan saw her weighing what she had against what she could lose. "When do we start, sir?" she finally asked, and her voice was steady as steel. But what neither of them knew yet was that the next 3 weeks would test every assumption Ryan had about strength, about skill, and about what it took to earn the respect of men who thought they'd already seen everything. Why were the SEALs staring at her like she'd just walked into the wrong funeral? Brooke stood at the entrance to the briefing tent, her gear bag slung over one shoulder, and felt the temperature in the room drop about 20 degrees. 12 operators sat around a table covered in maps and satellite photos, and every single one of them had turned to look at her with expressions ranging from confusion to outright hostility. "This is a joke, right?" one of them said, a thick-necked operator with a Tennessee drawl. "Commander, you're not seriously telling us we're babysitting?" "Staff Sergeant Harper is your primary shooter for Operation Pale Horse," Ryan cut him off, his voice carrying that edge of command that made even cocky SEALs think twice. "She's got more confirmed long-range kills than anyone in this room, and she's the best person for this specific shot. We brief in 5. Anyone got a problem with that, you can take it up with me after. In private." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Brooke kept her eyes forward, her face neutral, even as she felt their stares dissecting her piece by piece. She'd learned long ago that showing fear or uncertainty in rooms like this was blood in the water. They would circle her until they found a weakness, and then they would tear into it until there was nothing left. She took a seat at the far end of the table, away from the cluster of operators, and began unpacking her notebook. The pages were filled with ballistic calculations, wind charts, temperature conversions, and 1,000 tiny notes written in her precise handwriting. It was her Bible, the accumulated knowledge of hundreds of shots across a dozen deployments, and she treated it with the same reverence other soldiers reserved for photos of their families. "So what's your body count, Harper?" another operator asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "How many bad guys you dropped?" It was a test. She knew it was a test. They wanted to see if she'd brag or deflate, if she'd try to prove herself or shrink from the question. She looked up, met his eyes steadily, and said simply, "Enough to be here." A few of them smirked at that, a grudging acknowledgement that she hadn't taken the bait. But the thick-necked one, whose name tape read Morrison, wasn't done. "You ever work a real mission, or just sit on a hilltop taking potshots at farmers?" Brooke felt that familiar tightness in her chest, that pressure that came from swallowing words she desperately wanted to say. But she'd learned that lesson too. Defending yourself in rooms like this only made it worse. Let them think what they wanted. Let them underestimate her. It would make the eventual reckoning that much more satisfying. Ryan slammed a photo down on the table hard enough to rattle the coffee mugs. "This is Rashid Haddad, Taliban commander, responsible for the deaths of 47 coalition troops and at least 200 civilians. He's been operating out of this compound in the mountains for 3 years, and every time we get close, he disappears into tunnels we can't map. 2 weeks ago, intel confirmed he'll be at this location for a meeting with other regional commanders. It's the first time we've had his location pinned down in 18 months. He pulled up a satellite image on the laptop, and Brooke leaned forward, her trained eye immediately analyzing angles and distances. The compound was nestled in a valley, surrounded by steep ridgelines that created natural choke points. Good for defense, bad for approach. "Nearest viable sniper position is here," Ryan continued, pointing to a ridge on the opposite side of the valley. 3,890 meters from the primary structure. That's 2.4 miles. In thin air at altitude with unpredictable mountain winds, and a target who will only be exposed for maybe 60 seconds. The room went quiet. 3,890. That wasn't just a long shot. That was legendary distance. That was the kind of number that ended up in history books or on memorial walls, depending on whether you made it or not. "That's impossible," Morrison said flatly. Even with the Barrett, even with perfect conditions, the margin of error at that distance is why Harper's here, Ryan interrupted. She's made shots at 2400 in worse conditions. She's our best option. Morrison turned to look at Brooke with naked skepticism. You really think you can make that shot, Princess? Princess? The word landed like a slap, but Brooke kept her face absolutely neutral. She looked at the satellite image, did some quick calculations in her head, factored in altitude and temperature ranges and the dozen other variables that would matter. It was at the very edge of what was physically possible. Maybe past the edge. But she'd spent 3 years pushing edges, testing limits, finding out what happened when you refused to accept that something couldn't be done. I think I can make the shot, she said quietly. But I'll need time to range the location, map the wind patterns and run the ballistics. 3 weeks minimum. You've got 3 weeks, Ryan said. After that, Haddad disappears back into his hole and we lose our window. This is a one-shot opportunity. Literally. Miss and he goes to ground for another 2 years. Make it and we save lives, lots of lives. No pressure, Brooke thought, but kept the sarcasm internal. She nodded once, accepting the mission the same way she accepted everything else, with that quiet determination that had carried her through a career of being told she didn't belong. Training starts tomorrow at 0500, Ryan announced. Morrison, your primary spotter. Hendricks, you're on security. Chen handles comms. The rest of you rotate support. Harper works with the rifle for 6 hours minimum each day. This team succeeds or fails together. Am I clear? A chorus of unenthusiastic yes, sirs followed. Brooke gathered her notebook and stood to leave, but Morrison blocked her path. He was a solid 6'3", outweighing her by at least 100 pounds, and he used every inch of that size advantage to loom over her. Let me tell you something, Harper, he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. I don't care what the commander thinks he saw. I don't care what numbers you claim. You're a liability. And when this goes wrong, when you choke under real pressure, it'll be real operators who pay the price. So do us all a favor and wash out now before you get someone killed. Brooke looked up at him, and for just a moment she let him see past the neutral mask. Let him see the cold fury that lived beneath the surface, the anger she'd been swallowing for years, the determination forged in 100 small humiliations and refusals to break. I guess we'll find out, won't we? She said softly. She stepped around him and walked out into the harsh Afghan sunlight, her gear bag heavy on her shoulder and her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. 3 weeks to prove she belonged. 3 weeks to make a shot that would either validate everything she'd suffered or confirm every doubt anyone had ever had about her. But there was something Morrison didn't know, something none of them knew. The shot at 2400 meters hadn't been her limit. It had been her starting point. And she'd spent the last 18 months getting better, getting stronger, getting ready for exactly this kind of impossible challenge. The question wasn't whether she could make the shot. The question was whether they'd let her try. Could a woman who'd been eating off the floor 3 days ago really outshoot, out-endure, and outperform the most elite operators in the military? The training started the next morning with a 10-mile ruck march through the mountains, full combat load, in altitude that made every breath feel like drowning. Brooke knew it was a test, knew they were waiting for her to fall behind, to ask for help, to prove that she didn't belong. So she kept pace, even when her lungs screamed and her legs turned to rubber, even when Morrison deliberately quickened the speed whenever she got close. They reached the training site, a makeshift range carved into the mountainside, and Brooke dropped her pack with the same heavy thud as the rest of them. Her hands were steady as she began setting up the Barrett, even though every muscle in her body was shaking from exertion. This was familiar territory. This was where she lived. Let's see what you got, Harper, Morrison said, pulling out his spotting scope. Show us this magic shooting you supposedly do. The first target was at 800 meters, a standard distance for a rifle like the Barrett. Brooke settled into position, checked her breathing, felt the rhythm of her heartbeat and sent the round downrange. The target's center disappeared. She moved to the next position, adjusted for a slight crosswind and sent another round. Another center hit. By the third shot, some of the skepticism had faded from Morrison's face. By the fifth, he was actually calling corrections properly instead of trying to sabotage her. By the time she'd worked her way out to 1,800 meters, the entire team had gathered to watch, their expressions shifting from doubt to grudging respect. But shooting on a controlled range with spotters and support was one thing. The real test came on day 3, when they ran the first full mission simulation. Brooke had to climb to a shooting position at 4,200 feet, set up in freezing conditions, and hold a firing position for 6 hours while the team ran security protocols and Morrison called simulated threats. The cold was vicious. It crept through every layer, numbing fingers and making muscles stiff and unresponsive. Brooke lay prone on the rocky ground, cheek welded to the stock, and forced herself to become part of the mountain. She'd learned this lesson in her first deployment. You didn't fight the discomfort, you accepted it. You made peace with the suffering and let it pass through you like wind through a chain-link fence. "She's shivering," one of the operators observed from the security position. "How's she supposed to make a shot if she can't hold steady?" But Morrison, who'd been watching through his spotting scope for the last hour, saw something they didn't. "Watch," he said quietly. Brooke closed her eyes for a long moment, took a breath that seemed to last forever, and when she opened them again, the trembling stopped. It was like watching someone flip a switch in their biology, forcing their body to obey through sheer force of will. She took the shot, and the distant target pinged with an impact that made the observers exchange glances. "How the hell did she do that?" someone muttered. "Discipline," Morrison said, and there was something new in his voice, something that might have been respect. But the physical tests were just the beginning. The SEALs had their own rituals, their own ways of determining who belonged, and they subjected Brooke to every one. They ran her through close-quarters combat drills, expecting her size to be a disadvantage. Instead, she used physics and leverage, turning their own momentum against them. When Morrison, who'd been the base wrestling champion 3 years running, charged at her during a grappling exercise, she sidestepped the 200-pound collision and used his own force to slam him face-first into the plywood wall. In 3 seconds flat, she had a training knife pressed to his jugular and her knee digging into his spine. The room went silent as Morrison tapped out, and Brooke stood up, offering him a hand as if she hadn't just humiliated the unit's best wrestler. He took it, and for the first time since she'd arrived, he actually smiled. "Where'd you learn to fight like that?" he asked, rubbing his neck. "Had to," Brooke said simply. "Being small means you learn different rules." The water confidence drills were even worse. They bound her hands and feet and threw her into the base pool, expecting panic. Instead, she bobbed like a cork, her breathing rhythmic and calm. When they tried to disorient her by spinning her underwater, she didn't fight the chaos. She went limp, conserving oxygen until the spinning stopped, then kicked to the surface with a terrifying efficiency that made the instructors exchange glances. "Most people panic when we spin them," Chen said afterward. "You looked almost bored." "I've had worse," Brooke replied, wringing water from her hair. By the third day, the mocking had stopped. By the fifth, they were setting an extra place at their table in the mess hall. She hadn't asked for their respect. She'd taken it piece by piece through suffering, through competence, through refusing to quit no matter what they threw at her. But Morrison pulled her aside one evening as the sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire and blood. "I owe you an apology, Harper," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "I judged you before you even got here, assumed you were some diversity quota that would get people killed. I was wrong." Brooke studied him for a long moment, weighing the sincerity behind the words. She'd heard apologies before, usually from people who wanted something or who were trying to protect themselves from consequences. But Morrison looked genuinely uncomfortable, like a man confronting his own prejudices, and not liking what he found. "I appreciate that," she said quietly. "But you should know, I don't need you to believe in me to do my job. I've been doing it just fine without anyone's belief for 3 years. What I need is for you to call the wind accurately and keep me alive long enough to take the shot. Can you do that?" Morrison met her eyes then, and she saw something shift in his expression, a hardening of resolve, a commitment. "Yeah," he said, "I can do that." The final week of training was spent at the actual shooting position, mapping wind patterns and running ballistic calculations for every conceivable condition. Brooke spent hours lying in the cold, learning the personality of the valley, the way air moved differently at dawn versus dusk, how temperature inversions created invisible walls that would push bullets off course. She filled her notebook with observations, building a mental map of the battlefield that would let her shoot by instinct when the time came. On the last training day, Ryan climbed up to the position to observe. He watched Brooke work through her pre-shot routine, the same careful ritual she'd performed 1,000 times before. Check the rifle, confirm zero, read the wind, calculate the solution. She moved with the confidence of someone who'd done this so many times that thinking wasn't required anymore. It had become muscle memory, instinct, faith. "You ready for this?" he asked. Brooke looked through her scope at the distant compound, at the tiny window where Haddad would appear for maybe 60 seconds, and felt that familiar mixture of fear and excitement. This was what she'd trained for. This was why she'd endured 3 years of humiliation and sabotage, and fighting for every scrap of respect. Not for glory or recognition, but for this moment when she could make a difference that mattered. "Yes, sir," she said, "I'm ready." But what she didn't tell him was that she'd found something during her final equipment check that morning. Her heated gloves, the ones essential for maintaining feeling in her trigger finger during the long hours of waiting in sub-zero temperatures, had been sabotaged. The wires were cleanly snipped, a final petty act from someone back at the base who hoped she'd fail, hoped she'd lose a finger to frostbite, hoped the shot would go wrong in some catastrophic way that would prove they'd been right about her all along. She hadn't reported it, hadn't asked for a replacement, because reporting it would mean delaying the mission, and delaying the mission meant Haddad would disappear back into his tunnels and the window would close. So she'd made a choice, the same choice she'd made 100 times before. She would pay whatever price was necessary to complete the mission, even if that price was pieces of herself. Sometimes survival isn't about preserving yourself. Sometimes it's about deciding what you're willing to lose. Why was Brooke Harper staring at her hands 3 days before the mission, knowing she might never have feeling in them again? They lay prone at 4,200 feet, surrounded by snow and silence and the weight of impossible expectations. The climb to the final hide site had been a torture test of endurance, made worse when Brooke realized her heated gloves weren't working. She'd checked the battery pack during a rest stop and found the wires snipped clean. Someone had sabotaged them. Someone back at the base who couldn't sabotage her skill had settled for sabotaging her body instead. She didn't complain, didn't turn back. She simply shoved her hands into her armpits to warm them, alternating every few minutes to keep feeling in her trigger finger. Her knuckles were turning a waxy white, the pain excruciating as the nerves began to die. But she accepted the frostbite as the price of the mission, sacrificing her own flesh to ensure the shot could be taken. Morrison noticed during hour 3, "Harper, your hands are fine," she cut him off, her voice brooking no argument. "Focus on your scope." But they both knew her hands weren't fine. The cold was a physical assault, gnawing through thermal layers and numbing fingers that needed to be sensitive enough to feel a trigger break measured in ounces. They'd been lying in the snow for 6 hours now, motionless, covered in white ghillie suits that made them part of the landscape. Brooke's lips were blue, her eyelashes frosted with ice crystals that caught the morning light like diamonds. Ryan watched her hand trembling slightly as she maintained her grip on the rifle. She closed her eyes, took a breath that seemed to last a minute, and when she opened them, the trembling stopped. It was terrifying to witness, that kind of mastery over biology. She was forcing her body to die a little so she could kill. 3890 confirmed, Brooke whispered, her cheek welded to the stock. Wind 6 to 8 left to right, air's clean. Ryan watched through his spotter scope as the tiny figure moved in the distant compound. Rashid Haddad, the ghost they'd been hunting for 3 years, walking across a courtyard without a care in the world because he believed he was untouchable at this distance. He believed no one could reach him here. He was about to learn differently. Suddenly, a crack whipped past their position, a supersonic snap that meant a bullet had missed them by inches. Counter-sniper, Ryan hissed, flattening himself against the ground. High right, 10 o'clock. They were exposed. The enemy knew they were there. A second round smashed into the rock near Brooke's elbow, sending stone shards into her arm that opened cuts through her thermal layer. Blood welled up, hot against the freezing air, but she didn't flinch, didn't roll away. She knew that if she moved, she lost her shot at the high-value target, so she stayed perfectly still while a sniper hunted her, betting her life that she could find her target before the enemy found her skull. The duel was a psychological nightmare. Brooke had to ignore the predator hunting her to kill the prey she was sent for. She could hear the enemy shooter cycling his bolt, the metallic sound echoing off the canyon walls. He was close, maybe 800 meters, while her target was nearly 4 kilometers away. It was suicide. She was bringing a telescope to a knife fight. "Harper, we need to move," Morrison said, his voice tight with fear he was trying to control. "That sniper has our position. He's going to—" "Ryan," Brooke interrupted, using his first name for the first time. "Give me the wind call for the primary. Ignore the counter-sniper. If I take the sniper, the primary escapes. We didn't come here to survive. We came here to win." The words hung in the frozen air like a challenge to fate itself. Ryan felt something twist in his chest. She was right. The mission wasn't to make it home alive. The mission was to stop Haddad, and she was willing to die to complete it. "Winds shifted," he called, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. 7 miles per hour left to right. Temperatures dropped 2 degrees. Adjust up 0.3 mils. Brooke's breathing slowed to nothing. Her world narrowed to the reticle, the crosshairs, the tiny figure in the distant courtyard who represented so much death and suffering. She could feel her heartbeat, that steady rhythm that marked time, that connected her to life even as she prepared to end someone else's. She'd learned to shoot between heartbeats, in that microsecond of stillness between contractions when the body was most stable. A third shot from the counter-sniper struck closer, so close that snow kicked up into Brooke's face. Morrison was calling for exfil, calling for them to abort, but Brooke had gone somewhere else. Somewhere beyond fear or self-preservation or rational thought. Somewhere only the best shooters ever reached, that zone where everything else fell away and only the shot mattered. "Sending it," she whispered. The Barrett roared and the recoil was vicious. The cold had made her shoulders stiff and vulnerable, and the scope bit into her brow, opening the old cut from a mortar attack weeks ago. Blood ran into her eye, blinding her instantly on the right side. She didn't wipe it away. She kept her left eye open, staring into the scope at nothingness, waiting for the report that would tell her if she just made history or thrown away her life for nothing. The bullet's flight time was over 5 seconds. 5 long seconds where the world suspended itself, where physics and fate wrestled for control. 5 seconds where Brooke Harper lay bleeding in the snow, partially blind, with an enemy sniper hunting her, and waited to learn if 3 years of suffering had been worth it. "Target down," the drone operator's voice crackled over the radio. "Direct hit. Haddad is confirmed KIA." Ryan let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. Almost 4 kilometers, 2.4 miles. That's a new world record, Harper, you just... But the enemy sniper was still there. As Haddad dropped, a fourth shot rang out from the ridge above. It struck Brooke's rifle, shattering the optic and driving the scope housing into her face with devastating force. She was thrown backward, unconscious before she hit the ground, blood pouring from her nose and forehead. The legendary Barrett lay twisted and broken in the snow beside her. Ryan scrambled to her, dragging her body behind the rock, screaming for the medic. She was limp, her face a mask of red, and for a terrifying moment, Ryan thought the record shot was a posthumous one, that she'd given her life for the mission, paid the ultimate price for proving she belonged. But then her chest moved. Shallow, labored breaths that meant she was still fighting, still refusing to quit even when her body had every reason to give up. They got her to the extraction chopper, and that's when something remarkable happened. She woke up mid-flight, spit blood onto the deck and tried to sit up. Her face was swollen shut on one side, a concussion rocking her brain, but her hands immediately went to her chest, checking for her notebook. The notebook with all her ballistic data, her life's work, the accumulated knowledge of thousands of shots. It was safe. She slumped back, grabbing Ryan's hand with a grip that was surprisingly weak. "Did he drop?" she rasped through broken lips. Ryan squeezed back, looking at the battered warrior who'd just rewritten history. "Yeah, Brooke, you got him." She tried to smile, but her face was too swollen. "Guess I'm a regular soldier again," she said, the words slurred but understandable. Ryan watched her, and he knew something had shifted. The army had just gained a legend who never wanted the title and lost a ghost who'd kept hundreds of troops alive without ever asking for thanks. Because with a shot like that, there was no more operating in the shadows, no more being invisible. The whole world was about to know her name. And she knew it too. That's why she'd made that comment about being anonymous again. She understood that everything was about to change, and Ryan saw in her eyes that she wasn't sure if she was ready for it. But ready or not, change was coming, and it was coming fast. What happens when the person everyone underestimated becomes the person everyone can't ignore? Back at the base, the mood had shifted before they even landed. News of the shot had arrived ahead of them, spreading through the military communications network like wildfire. 3,890 meters. A new world record. A shot that defied physics and probability and everything anyone thought was possible. As Brooke was offloaded onto a stretcher, Hayes was there, watching from the edge of the helipad. The same Hayes who'd dumped her food, who'd made her clean floors on her hands and knees, who'd stood over her with that sick smile while his friends laughed. He looked at her broken face now, then at the shattered rifle case, and for the first time there was no smirk. He looked small, terrified by the scale of violence she'd endured and delivered. He took a step forward as if to help carry the stretcher, then stopped, realizing he didn't have the right. He'd forfeited that right every time he'd chosen cruelty over decency. He turned and walked away into the dark, vanishing into the mediocrity he belonged to, and Brooke didn't even notice. He was background noise. He always had been. As the medics wheeled her toward the surgical tent, something extraordinary happened. The entire SEAL platoon lined up in silence, blocking the path of the regular infantry gawkers who'd come to see the spectacle. One by one, they removed the Velcro unit patches from their shoulders, the trident that marked them as the elite, the symbol that meant more to them than rank or ribbons or anything else the military could offer. And they slapped those patches onto the blanket covering Brooke. It was a violation of uniform regulation, a gesture that would get them all reprimanded, but nobody cared. It was the highest honor they could give, a silent message to the entire base that while she wore an army uniform, her soul belonged to the brotherhood of those who ran toward the fire. Hayes watched from the shadows, touching his own bare shoulder, and the gesture said everything. He would live 100 years and never earn a fraction of the respect she'd gained in a single second. And he knew it. They all knew it. The shot at 3890 would go into the history books. Military academies would study it. Snipers would train their entire careers trying to match it. But Ryan Caldwell knew the real story wasn't about the distance or the conditions or the impossibility of what she'd accomplished. The real story was about the quiet woman who'd shown up every single day despite the urine-soaked bedding and the food dumped on the floor and the sabotaged equipment. who'd made the impossible look ordinary through sheer force of will. In the hospital tent, after they'd stitched her face and wrapped her damaged hands and given her enough painkillers to drop most people into unconsciousness, Brooke lay staring at the canvas ceiling. Morrison came to visit, sitting awkwardly beside her cot. "You saved a lot of lives today, Harper," he said quietly. "That shot, that was something special." "It was just a shot," she replied, her voice thick from the swelling. "Same as any other." "No," Morrison said firmly. "It wasn't, and you know it wasn't. You bet your life on that trigger pull. You took fire from a counter-sniper and didn't flinch. You lost feeling in your hands and still made the shot. That's not ordinary, that's extraordinary." Brooke was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer. "You know what the hardest part was? It wasn't the distance. It wasn't the cold. It wasn't even getting shot in the face. The hardest part was the 3 years before today. The hardest part was showing up every morning knowing I'd have to fight just to exist. Knowing that every meal, every briefing, every equipment check would be a battle to prove I had the right to be there." Morrison nodded slowly, shame coloring his features. "I was part of that. I made it harder for you, and I'm sorry." "You changed your mind," Brooks said. "That's more than most people do. Most people, once they decide you're not worth their time, they never reconsider. You did. That matters." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the bass outside. Life continuing, oblivious to the small moment of grace happening inside the tent. "What happens now?" Morrison asked. "With the record and the media attention and everything." Brooke closed her eyes, suddenly exhausted. "I don't know. Part of me wants to disappear, go back to being anonymous, but I guess that's not an option anymore." She paused, then added quietly, "Maybe it never was." 3 days later, when Brooke was cleared to return to duty, she found something waiting at her bunk. Someone had replaced her ruined mattress with a new one. Someone had hung a clean blanket, military issue but pristine. And someone had placed a small plaque on the wall beside her cot. It read simply, "SSG Brooke Harper, 3,890 m, the longest confirmed kill in military history." She stood looking at it for a long time, feeling the weight of those numbers, feeling the weight of everything they represented. Not just the shot, but the journey. Not just the record, but the respect it had finally earned her. That evening she walked into the mess hall, and for the first time in 3 years, the room didn't fall silent when she entered. Instead, people nodded, made space at tables, offered casual greetings like she was just another soldier, not an object of curiosity or contempt. It was the most ordinary moment of her entire deployment, and somehow it meant more than any medal or commendation ever could. She sat down with her tray, and Morrison slid into the seat across from her without asking. Then Chen, then Hendricks, then more, until the table was full of people who wanted to sit with her not because she'd set a record, but because she'd earned her place among them. "So," Morrison said, breaking into his MRE, "next time we get an impossible mission, you interested?" Brooke smiled, and despite the stitches and the swelling and the pain that still radiated through her face, it was genuine. Always. Because that's what she'd learned through all of it. Through the cruelty and the doubt and the sabotage and the cold that had nearly cost her her fingers. She'd learned that belonging wasn't something you asked for or waited to be given. It was something you took, piece by piece, shot by shot, day by day. It was something you built through competence and resilience and refusing to quit even when every rational voice in your head screamed that you should. And she'd learned something else too, something more important than any record or recognition or respect. She'd learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply show up. Show up despite the humiliation. Show up despite the pain. Show up despite every voice telling you that you don't belong and you never will. Because showing up, day after day after day, is its own form of victory. The shot at 3890 became legend. They'd tell the story in training academies for generations. They'd study the ballistics, analyze the conditions, marvel at the precision. But what they'd miss, What they couldn't capture in reports or diagrams or case studies was the quiet courage it took just to pull the trigger, the years of suffering that led to that one moment, the price she paid not in blood or bullets, but in dignity sacrificed and respect earned one painful inch at a time. Ryan Caldwell, watching from across the mess hall, saw it all. Saw the way she sat a little straighter now, not because she'd proven something to others, but because she'd finally proven it to herself. Saw the way her hands, wrapped in bandages from the frostbite, still moved with that same careful precision as she opened her meal. Saw the way she belonged, not because anyone had given her permission, but because she'd simply decided she did. And he understood then what he'd been witnessing all along, not just the making of a record-setting sniper, but the forging of something far more rare. Someone who'd looked at a system designed to break them and had decided, quietly and with terrifying determination, that they would not break, would not bend, would not disappear. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. Sometimes it doesn't argue or explain or defend itself. Sometimes it simply exists, quiet and unshakable, like a figure in the snow, finger on a trigger, waiting for the moment when the impossible becomes real. And sometimes, just sometimes, that's enough to change everything.